All right, and away we go. So what we're going to be doing today is we are going to start our first look at something that is covered extensively in the textbook. It's going to be chapter 4. It's going to be our beginning look at attention. And we're going to take a look at a few aspects of attention, differentiate between two very different types of processing and two very different types of attention. And all of this, again, is in service of understanding the human mind. So we can pay attention to certain things in our external reality. We can ignore and not pay attention to other things. Paying attention is part of that conceptual level. I got it right the first time. Computational level in Mars tri-level hypothesis. So we know that we can focus in on certain things and not focus in on others. So it's part of the human mind. And so we're going to take a look at that. And once again, just remember, human mind does not equal the human brain. So we are not going to see any neurons or any sort of localization of function here today. But what we will take a look at is how exactly is it that we attend to things. So what is it that attention actually is? How do we define it as cognitive psychologists? What is it that draws our attention, and how do we process certain things, and what implications does that have for what we attend to in the world? So attention is what we're going to be focusing on today, but before we get there, we're going to wrap up, as promised, our look at alternative artificial intelligence and the Turing test. So we're going to talk about a logical fallacy and a rhetorical strategy called moving the goalposts. We're going to first apply that to 19th century anthropology, and then we're going to take a look at how that might be true for ChatGPT and the Turing test. And then we'll take a look at what attention is, serial versus parallel processing, and we'll take a look at a few examples of that, do some in-class demos. We'll take a look at change detection and what that says about how good and how extensive your processing of the external world is. I shouldn't say how good, because that's a loaded term. Your processing, so as we move through cognitive psychology, you're going to find a lot of instances where the actual ability of your mind is far less than what you may have assumed it was, right? And that's one of the reasons why we have experiments and we do the kind of studies that we do to figure out exactly what can the mind do. However, that does not mean that your mind isn't performing well. It doesn't mean that it's not a good performer. Your mind performs as well as it needs to in order for you to survive, without performing so above and beyond what is necessary as to basically take up a whole bunch of resources that could be used elsewhere. So your mind is as good as it can be and as lazy as it can be, all at the same time. It's both, and both things can be true. So we'll take a look at change detection again and what that tells us about how extensively we attend to the external reality. And then we'll end with where does attention come from? Stimulus-driven attention and goal-driven attention. And speaking of goals and goalposts, we're going to talk about the idea of moving the goalposts. And moving the goalposts, it's a metaphor that refers to when somebody changes the rules or criterion of a process or a competition while it's still in progress, and changes it in such a way as that new criterion or the new goal offers an advantage to one side versus the other. So, for example, if you were in a class at a very large university. So I went to undergrad in a large university, and the goal of intro classes in that university, the goal of intro psychology, the goal of intro to computer science, the goal of intro to physics, was literally to fail half the students, because they did not have room in their second year courses for the amount of students that wanted to take those classes. So their goal was literally to fail half of the students. So a professor might say, well, in order to pass my course, you have to achieve 60%. If at the end of the semester, more than 50% of the students achieved that passing grade, the professor would be moving the goalposts. If all of a sudden he said, you know what, change my mind, is actually 70%, to pass this course. So it's that moving of the criterion while the competition, while the procedure is still in process. It's still in progress. And we're going to see a recent example of moving the goalposts that ties into a historical example where the goalposts were initially set. I'm sure that made no sense, but maybe Neil deGrasse Tyson can help us out here a little bit.
That the most racist scientific community ever were 19th century anthropologists. They're the ones that set up the race and this, and white male humans were at the top of the evolutionary ladder, and blacks and everybody else were lower, still evolving, closer to the apes and all this. This was going on for coming out of the 18th century into the 19th century. But point is, in the 1990s, now that we do genetic tracking things, now we do genetic tracking.
Yeah.
The world found out that Europeans are between 1% and 3% Neanderthal genetically, and Africans are 0% Neanderthal. So in the 1990s, research papers started coming out talking about how creative and imaginative the Neanderthals must have been, and how they used a complete facelift of the Neanderthal that started at the time they learned this.
Okay, so here we have an example of moving the goalposts. Originally, Neanderthals were considered to be less developed, lower forms of cognition, lower forms of humanity, and that was the goalpost that was set into place. But once genetic research and genetic coding revealed that Europeans were 1% to 2% Neanderthals while Africans were not, then all of a sudden the goalposts were moved. And all of a sudden Neanderthals were not lower intelligence, they were actually highly creative. They weren't unable to do cognition. Actually, they were very skilled and had other, attributes that are very well prized. So those goalposts were moved while the sort of procedure was still going on, in this case with the Neanderthals. So why do I bring that up? I bring that up because the same thing I believe is happening with ChatGPT and alternative intelligence just in general. So we have discussed the Turing test, that idea of testing whether or not an artificial alternative intelligence, a computer in this case, has a mind by simply seeing if a judge can distinguish between a human mind versus the computer's mind by simply asking it different questions. And for years, for decades. I mean, this came out when Alan Turing proposed it back in the 40s and probably 40s. So for decades, no computer program has come close to passing the Turing test. And in fact, if you take a look at some of the old examples, it was comedic in terms of how badly they failed the Turing test. However, now you can make a strong argument that ChatGPT does actually pass the Turing test. So let's take an example here from the world of news.
ChatGPT, from a company called OpenAI. It is a program that can take a prompt and generate human-sounding writing in just about any format and style. It is a striking capability that multiple reporters have used to insert the same shocking twist in their reports.
Well, just heard me reading, it wasn't written by me. It was written by artificial intelligence, ChatGPT.
ChatGPT wrote everything I just said.
That was a news copy. I asked ChatGPT to write.
Remember what I said earlier? But ChatGPT, well, I asked ChatGPT to write that line for me. Users who are. Then I asked for a knock-knock joke. Knock-knock, who's there? ChatGPT. ChatGPT who? ChatGPT careful, you might not know how it works.
Yeah, they sure do love that game. It may seem unwise to demonstrate the technology that could well make you obsolete. I will say, knock-knock jokes should have always been part of breaking news. But who's there? Not the Hindenburg, that's for sure. 36 in New Jersey.
All right, so every single person that was watching those news reports, if they were shocked, if they had that clutch the pearls moment when they were told that, oh, what I just read to you was written by a computer, that's passing the Turing test. If they were surprised and thought to themselves, oh my gosh, I can't believe it, that's literally passing the Turing test. So we have multiple examples of ChatGPT being indistinguishable from human verbal production. So whether it's writing copy for a news report, whether it's elementary school teachers bemoaning the fact that essays are being turned in, that they suspect are being written by ChatGPT. And again, this is the key, that they suspect is being written by ChatGPT, not being able to prove it, not being able to call it out. And that indicates that ChatGPT, in a very real sense, has passed the Turing test. However, as soon as this started happening, as soon as these sorts of examples started coming out, you started seeing articles like this and discussions like this. So what kind of mind does ChatGPT have? And it had quotes in here such as produce something that sounds like how a real person would talk about these topics. So it's not that it's actually how a person would talk about these topics. It sounds like what a person would do, but it can't actually be what a person can do. Notice that the Turing test, which was accepted by many people as a good test of whether something has a mind or does not, basically doesn't make a distinction between sounds like a human mind or a real person versus, actually is a human mind or a real person. And then we have a system like ChatGPT doesn't create, it imitates. So once again, we have this idea that, well, you can pass the Turing test. Those used to be the old goalposts, but now that those have been surpassed, let's move it over here. And you actually, it's not enough that you sound or can be indistinguishable from a human mind, but you actually have to create and not just imitate. And I do not know who can possibly show anybody that creates and does not imitate whatsoever. Everybody builds on the things that came before. You take a look at paintings in the Renaissance. For example, Brunelleschi came up with the geometry for perspective, and literally within a decade, everybody was drawing in perspective, and nobody went to them and said, well, you know what, I don't really think that you're a real artist because you're just imitating, you're not actually creating. It's just, again, that moving of the goalposts. And then we also have, it instead copies, manipulates, and pastes together text that already exists, originally written by human intelligences. That is literally every single research paper that has ever been written, right? Every single research paper that I have ever wrote I don't copy, that's the one thing I don't do because that's plagiarism, but I do manipulate, I do piece together text that already exists, I do take ideas that other people, other human intelligence has written, and I put them together in a new form to make the point that I'm trying to make. The point that I'm making is that now that ChatGPT and other programs have passed the Turing test, those goalposts that were initially there, and they said, you know what, that is good, that's where we're gonna have it. Those goalposts have now been moved. And that's just something to be aware of when society is going through changes, to know when there is an inherent bias against, certain people. So we don't have to go back too far in our history to see that other marginalized groups, were treated exactly the same as we are now treating ChatGPT and AI. And we might be here birthing a new consciousness, a new entity, a new thing into this world. And we need to be very, very careful that we don't bias ourselves against it simply because ChatGPT does not look like us. All right, any questions or comments before we start our look at attention? Yep.
Are there AI language models that aren't run specifically on prompts?
Not large language models that I can think of. What are you thinking about?
I was just thinking, I feel like for this intelligence, all we're doing is asking it questions, but it hasn't been given the ability to just kind of do it at once, kind of a thing, if
Oh,
you
okay.
can.
Yeah.
Built around it that way.
Yeah, it's interesting that that's a really interesting kind of topic. There are some artificial intelligence that we have that are not very impressive, but also just do what they want. And one example of that came to my mind is a Roomba. So the robot vacuums, they do what they want. They basically turn on and then they go where they want to. And there's a very, very simple rule for the Roomba. And this is one of those, we're going to talk about this when we talk about perception. One of the big breakthroughs that people had in not artificial intelligence, but in robot vision, was in robot maneuvering in the world, was to use the world as its own reference, use the external world as its own representation rather than representing it internally. So what they used to do is they used to try in all these machine navigating systems, they used to try to represent the external world internally. So you would build a robot vacuum and you would try to program in exactly what was in the room. And then the robot would go on a predetermined path and it would do fine until somebody did this. And then your robot wouldn't know how to do it because that is no longer represented in their internal representation. What Roomba basically did and where the advance came was they said, all right, let's use the external world as its representation. And all we're going to do is build in rules on how to react to that. So we're going to say, go forward until you hit something and then turn a little bit and continue going forward. And if you hit something else, turn again. If you hit something else, turn again. And that way the external world is representing itself and it can move around in ways that and basically clean your entire room. So that's one example. The other example I remember happening, and there's actually two of these. This is one of the dangers of AI being built the way that it's being built, because we're feeding alternative intelligence and these large language models. We're feeding it human intelligence, right? We're feeding it examples of this is what humans have come up with before. And humans have not exactly come up with the greatest things before. And it's difficult for artificial intelligence to make that distinction. Artificial intelligence is almost like that child that is placed into a complex social situation. And they do something that's socially unacceptable. Like they point at somebody who looks different and they go, "What's that?" And you need to be like, well, we don't do that. We don't react in that way. This is a teaching moment right now. And AI, I think, is also in that kind of a situation. So there was this really early famous example. Has anybody heard of, I think it was called like Forever Seinfeld or Perpetual Seinfeld? So it was people using ChatGPT and a video rendering program decided that they were going to create a streaming show that was basically Seinfeld. So if you remember from the 90s, Seinfeld was a sitcom. It was basically Seinfeld, but written by AI and animated by AI, which means that it could be a never-ending show. So there's this idea that I had, if you can make content at a rate of 1 second per second, you could make a TV show that never ended. You can make a TV show that you could binge and you would never run out, right? It's just kind of like if you spend 5 minutes away from the show, that show is now 5 minutes past where you were. And you can spend 5 minutes to catch up, but by the time you catch up, the show is 5 minutes further along. So you can make an unbingeable show using artificial intelligence. Well, they tried to do that and they had to shut it down because it went racist and sexist so fast that it was shocking. So they basically let it run and woke up the next morning and looked at everything that had happened. And they were like, oh my gosh, shut this down. And the same thing happened, I think, with a chatbot that it was either Microsoft or Google put on the X platform. And it just went super racist, super fast. And part of the problem is that it had been built on the store of human knowledge. And if you have certain prompts that go in certain ways, if you have certain people asking certain questions, much like somebody who gets radicalized after they fall down a rabbit hole in Reddit, right? And the person that you thought you knew, all of a sudden in a weekend, they're like, oh, who are you and where did all these ideas come from? Same thing happened to AI in these two examples. So I don't know. Those are the only ones that I can think of where they let it go. And I would say it passes the Turing test on whether or not you can distinguish it from horrible humans, right? I mean, it didn't say anything where people were like, well, this makes no sense. It said a lot of things where they're like, well, this is incredibly racist. This sounds like an incredibly racist person, and it sounds like an incredibly sexist person. So those are the only times they ran amok. But it is interesting, the whole AI debate and the sort of AI worries. There's a lot of things that they're worried about, but one of the things is that humans are worried about being displaced from their position of intellectual power in this universe. That's one of the big things. And there's a lot of sort of safeguards that you're trying to build in. One of the most interesting thought experiments that I read, I can't remember the name of the person that proposed it, but they said that if you put a computer and you disconnect it from any sort of escape, you put it in a room, it's got its own separate power source, it's not linked up to any cables, it doesn't have any sort of Wi-Fi, it's shielded from everything. You have encapsulated this computer into an unescapable room, right? So that there's no way that it can get out. This person proved that eventually, if that AI continually increases its intelligence, it will get smart enough to trick whoever is managing that room into letting it out. And it's not that, well, there's a chance that it'll happen. Eventually, it will happen that it'll trick it and get out. And there's a lot of worry about what a AI that is running amok would do to our existence. But this is the last thing I'll mention on this before we, unless there's a follow-up question before we go to intelligence, to attention. There's this idea of like a doomsday scale, I think it is, and it's the idea of how likely is any sort of advancement or any sort of technological product or any sort of basically any sort of entity, how likely is it that it will result in the destruction of mankind? And they do this on a scale of like 1 to 100%. And people are worried, and maybe I'm just being cynical, but people are worried that AI, if it ever gets out, if it ever kind of lose control of it, the probability that it'll wipe out humanity is something like maybe 50%, maybe as high as 90%, right? Some experts, vary in terms of how how high they go. I would say it's about 50, because we're looking at an intelligence that we don't know how it's going to react, right? We don't know how it's going to think. There's a lot of examples of AI being asked to solve problems and play video games and coming up with strategies that nobody has ever come up with before, because it is a very different type of intelligence. So I would say the chances of AI wiping us out is 50%. The chances of AI turning our world into a paradise is 50%. We got a 50-50 chance. Now that would be worrisome. You can call me cynical for this next point, but I believe that if human beings are in charge of this world, we are 100% doomed. It's just my own personal belief. And if anything about what's happened in the last 50 years with global warming, climate change, any sort of nuclear armaments and anything like that does not have you think that, feel free to send me a message in Canvas messages and maybe get my number down a little bit. But I personally think that AI is gonna be a better steward of this world and of humanity than we humans have been. All right, but that's not cognitive psychology, or is it? Maybe it's just out there. But anyways, any final thoughts before we turn to attention? All right, now we're turning to attention. So what is attention? What is it that kind of grabs your focus, grabs your processing ability? What does it even mean to attend to something? So let's say that you were shown this painting here. So this is the School of Athens by Raphael, drawn using perspective that they learned from Brunelleschi, so imitating the geometry that they had before. And there's a lot of stuff going on in this painting. There's a lot to take in. There's a lot of people in this painting. And if I told you that Raphael in this painting hid one of his contemporaries, Leonardo da Vinci, and I asked you to find out where that is, what you would need to do is you would need probably to attend to pieces of this picture at a time. And you might take a look at every single face and eventually say, oh, wait a second, there he is, that little square there. That is based on Leonardo da Vinci. So you needed to focus your attention in on this painting in order to solve that particular problem. If any of you are familiar with 90s heavy metal hard rock band Guns N' Roses, they released a double album called Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. And that image is taken from the School of Athens. So if I asked you to find this image somewhere in the painting, once again, you're going to probably go from piece to piece to piece, look at this person, look at this person, and eventually you're going to say to yourself, oh, wait a second, there it is. That's the one right there. But it required you to process certain small parts of that painting and ignore other parts. If you ever want to see more modern examples of attention dialed up to like 11, just take a look at any theorist YouTube channel or theorist websites, and you'll have things like all the details in the Spider-Man Far From Home trailer that you totally missed. And what they're doing is they're focusing their attention literally frame by frame, image by image, to locate even the smallest detail. Now, if I asked you what is wrong with that passport, it might take you a while to figure out what it is, because you need to go piece by piece by piece by piece by piece before you realize that they don't have the year on his birth date because they didn't want to age this movie. They don't want you coming back to this movie in 2040 and going, oh, well, Spider-Man would have been 40 years old today. They didn't want that to happen. So they took out the year. But again, this is something that you wouldn't just notice. It's not something where if you looked at that passport, you're like, hey, wait a second, where's the date? It requires somebody to go in there, attend to pieces of it at a time before you can notice that missing information. All right, so what is attention? So attention is defined as the ability to focus on specific stimuli or locations. So it's that ability to narrow your field of inquiry, your field of, I'm trying not to use the word attention, but your field of processing to a specific stimulus or specific location. And attention is not just that ability, but it's also the process by which information is selected for processing, right? And this happens when there's more information than can be processed. So attention is both the ability. So somebody might say, hey, that person has a lot of attention. They have a great attention span. They're very focused. They have very high attention. And it's also the process or the action of attending as well. So when you tell somebody, hey, pay attention, what you're saying is, hey, process information in a very selected way. So what are some examples of the types of attention that we have? Well, two major types of attention are parallel processing and serial processing. So parallel processing, this is where you process multiple units of information at a time. So think about your human mind and think about, in representational terms, you have some abstract processor in your human mind. If it's a parallel processor, you can process multiple units of information at the same time. On the other hand, if it's a serial processor, you can only process one unit of information at a time. So let's take a look visually what this would look like. So once again, let's say that you have a parallel processor in your mind. So that is a representation of a parallel processor in your mind. Do you have a gray rectangle outlined in blue in your mind somewhere? Probably not. But this again is that representational level explanation. This is the possible strategy that we use when we're doing attention. So we have an input side. So information comes in from the left. And we got an output side, information gets processed and then gets ejected out of the right. And then we have, let's say, information units. So each of these circles, each of these spheres represents one unit of information. So it's coming in from the external world. So it could be things like, Leonardo da Vinci, the boy on the Use Your Illusion cover, other people, Pythagoras was somewhere in the School of Athens. I think Raphael put himself in the School of Athens. So all of this information, let's say from the School of Athens, is coming in. And it's coming in and it's getting closer and it's getting closer and it's getting closer. And then it goes into the parallel processor. And the parallel processor processes it somehow and sends it to other places in the mind. So it processes it by just increasing the contrast and increasing the brightness. But notice that it takes all of the units that are coming in. It can take 4 units at a time and process all 4 units at the same time. And then the next 4 units of information that come in, they all get processed at the same time. And the next 4 units that come in all get processed at the same time. And those final 4 units all get processed at the same time. So we have processed 16 units of information, and we've done it rather quickly. And that is an example of how a parallel processor would work. On the other hand, you can have a serial processor. A joke was way better than that reaction. All right, so you have a serial processor. And once again, information units come in from the left. Information units go out on the right. And we have the same number of information units. So we have those 16 information units that we just processed using the parallel processor. And let's say that they're now sent in your mind to your serial processor. And those information units are coming in. We got 16 of them. And now they come to the serial processor, but a serial processor can only process one piece of information at a time. It has to process information in a series. It can't do it parallel. It needs to do it in a series. So it attends to that top stream of information and says, all right, I'm going to turn my attention, I'm going to turn my processing power to this particular stream of information. And I'm going to process those information units. And now that that processing is done, I can turn my attention to the next stream of information and I can process those units. And notice that the first stream of information units gets sent off to somewhere else in your mind. And now that the second stream of information is done processing, it can turn its attention to the third stream, and so on and so forth, until it gets to the final stream, that fourth stream, and processes the final 4 pieces of information. So those are 2 different types of processing that we have in our mind. And those are 2 different examples of implications that this kind of a representation has for your ability to do cognition, for your ability to interact with the world. So what are some of the differences? Well, a parallel processing has few steps. It doesn't take very many steps to process 16 units of information in this example. So if you go back to the sequence that we had, it takes about, let's say, 8 total steps in order to process all of these units of information. And that includes the time that it took the information to get to the serial processor. So this is actually a couple of steps more than it would actually take. But let's say that it takes 8 steps to process those 16 units of information. A serial processor, on the other hand, it takes a lot of steps to process the same amount of information. So those same units, 16 units of information, took this serial processor 23 steps to process. So parallel got it done in 8. Serial, it took 23. So parallel processing is evidenced in our mind when we process information quickly. Serial processing is evidenced in our mind when we process information more slowly. And not just more slowly, but as we're going to see, there's a specific pattern that we'll encounter when we do serial processing. So any questions on the basic conceptual difference between serial and parallel processing? All right. So let's take a look at some examples of serial and parallel processing. Before we get to that, just because the serial processor joke went over so well, I want to try one small little demo. So before we get to the other demo. So if anybody here has ever watched sports ball, if anybody here has ever watched a sporting event, you'll know that fans cheer for their team, for their favorite athletes. And sometimes it's super loud, like in a football game, but other times it's very demure, right? Very intentional. Like you can't just go crazy. And one of the sports where that's true is golf, right? So in golf, when somebody makes a good shot, you have that very polite little golf clap. So what I would like to do is I would like to ask everybody to just give me a very, very small, little polite golf clap if you can. All right, very nice. Now let's keep going, but let's double that. All right, and let's do that one more time, but let's double that. All right, one more time, but let's go as loud as we possibly can. You're gonna throw this up. So what was the point of doing that? The point of doing that is twofold. Number one, if I ask you to start with your biggest effort clap, we wouldn't have gotten nearly as loud. So why did it happen that way when we started with the golf clap? It happened that way because the golf clap was a low risk, low effort entry into this. And once you did your little golf clap, you realize that participating is not so bad. It's not so daunting. It's not so scary. So take that into the next demo because we're going to have a few demos here and they only work if everybody is participating. So the first one, examples of parallel versus serial processing, is going to be face perception. I'm going to put two faces up on the screen. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to look at those two faces and indicate which one is weird. And if the face on the left is weird, I want you to raise your left hand. If the face on the right is weird, I want you to raise your right hand. Okay, so you're looking for something that's weird with these faces. Once you see it, if it's on the left, left hand goes up. If it's on the right, right hand goes up. Everybody ready? All right, good. So we got everybody. And that took about, I would say about 10 seconds at least. And it was very staggered in terms of how quickly people, put up their hands. Some people it was very quick. Other people were, a little bit slower to get to that decision. So let's try that again. Two more faces. Once again, one of them is weird in some way. And as soon as you see it, put your hand up. Everybody ready? All right, much quicker. And also notice everybody was in unison. So what does that mean? What does that indicate about the way that our minds work? Well, it indicates that facial processing of human faces is something that is very important to us, but more so upright human faces are very important to us. And inverted human faces are not so important to us. So we have a parallel processing unit in our mind. We have parallel processing units in our mind that process upright faces, but we do not have parallel processing units in our mind to process inverted faces. So when you looked at these inverted faces here, holistically, they look fine. But in order to notice the weirdness of the fact that the mouth and the eyes are flipped horizontally, you basically had to go piece by piece for each of these faces. You couldn't just take in the whole face and all the units of information that a face has. You had to go in there and say, well, wait a second. That face is upside down, but that eyebrow is above the eye. That doesn't make any sense. And then, yeah, there's this one here as well. Let me process this part of the face, and that doesn't make any sense. And now that I noticed the mouth, I also noticed that the mouth kind of, is a frown, but it's really out of proportion and it's sort of out of place. So after processing piece by piece, location by location, you're able to say, okay, yeah, it's the one on the right that is the incorrect face. That's because inverted faces, they're processed serially. You have to go piece by piece by piece. And that's also why it took people different amounts of time, because some of you might have gotten to the eye right away. And you might have said to yourself, oh, well, that eye is weird. I processed that rather quickly. That must be the thing that was wrong. Others of you might have started at the nose. And you would have concluded, no, the nose is fine. Then maybe you went to the ear and you're like, well, no, the ear is fine. Then you went to the eye or the mouth, and that's when you noticed that there was a difference. So serial processing has a much different pattern of behavior and reaction times than parallel processing. And this was almost immediate that you noticed which face was weird. And it was also very uniform across everyone, because human faces, upright human faces, are so important that there is evidence that we have dedicated facial processing systems in our mind, so that instead of having to take these piece by piece, we just take the whole thing all at once. And we process all of that information all at once. And we are very, very easily make the decision that that face is incorrect, that those eyes are not in the correct place, or they're inverted. The mouth is weird. Those teeth are not bottom teeth or upper teeth. It's very, very simple, and it occurs very quickly. All right, a few more examples. We're going to do one now with visual search. And this is this is one where we are going to time this a little bit in a very, very unscientific way. But just bear with me real quick. All right, so I am going to, we're going to start off, I believe. All right, yes, okay, so this is another demonstration. What we're going to do is we are going to put a letter on the next screen. It's going to be a B. You are looking for the B. This is a visual search task. There's going to be distractor P's. So there's going to be P's up on the screen, but somewhere there's a B. And all I want you to do is, as soon as you see it, raise your hand. So just let me know that, okay, I found it, I see it, boom, we're good. So, and I will take the reaction times. All right, so is everybody ready? So hands up as soon as you see it. Everybody good? All right, you're looking for the B, and go. Oops. And go. All right, so that took about 2 seconds. All right, next one is going to be a little harder. Everybody ready? Go. All right, that one took about 6. All right, last one. Everybody ready? All right, that one took about, let's say, 8. All right, so that was demonstration part A. Now we got demonstration part B, where you don't find the B, you find the O. So there's going to be an O on the screen, and it's going to be among distractor X's. So as soon as you see the O, raise your hand, let me know that you've seen it. Everybody ready? And go. All right, it's about 2 seconds. All right, next one. Took about 2 seconds. Last one. Okay, also took about 2 seconds. Great. We all have serial and parallel processors. Okay, so what did I just measure here? So here's a graph of your performance during these 2 demonstrations. So we have the black line, that is the reaction time that you had, finding the B among the distractor P's. We have the open circles, that is where you found the O in the X's. And as you can see, there's a very, very different pattern here. So for the B's and the P's, the more distractors that there were, the longer it took you to find where that B is. However, for the O and the X's, the longer or the more distractors, the more number of items that were in the display, it did not change the amount of time that it took you to find that O. And the reason for that is because the B's and P's, that requires a serial processor. Because of the difference between those two letters, we won't go into exactly why that's a serial processor, but that pattern of results indicates a serial processor. And your experience of searching for that B was probably going, okay, is it there? No, is it there? No, is it that one? No, you were probably scanning through the entire visual search until you found your B. And that's why it took longer when we went to 50 and then to 100 of those distractor Ps. On the other hand, the gray circles there, the O's and the X's, that was processed by a serial processor. And it was, we can tell that it's, parallel processor. That was processed by a parallel processor. And we know this because we added more distractors, but you were still able to process it as quickly as when there were fewer. So when you had, let's go back to the, there we go. So when we had only 2 items, you processed all of those at the same time and said, yes, I see the O. When we had 50 items, you processed all of those at the same time and said, yes, I see the O. That's why it took you 2 seconds each time. When we had 100 items, you processed all of them at the same time and said, yep, I see the O. So once again, this is evidence of that idea of a parallel processor being able to take in all the information, whereas a serial processor needs to go one point at a time when you're processing that information in the world. All right, any questions on serial versus parallel? All right, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit. Now we're going to talk about change detection. So one of the things that we sort of feel, and we kind of believe through introspection, is that we are basically attending to the world, and we attend to a lot of the world. We kind of feel that we notice a lot of the world as it is, and we have this true representation of what the world is like in our minds. So change detection is this phenomenon, and it demonstrates the need that we have for attention to detect changes in our environment. And this is because we need to process that information that indicates that something has changed. And we are going to start with a demonstration of that with the redacted thing that we're going to take a look at. So this is going to be an awareness test. Just follow the instructions and we will see how everybody does.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13.
All right, how many people got 13? All right, pretty good. So we were attending, we were processing specifically that information, and we got 13 passes.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
How many people saw the moonwalking bear? All right, we got 1, we got 2. All right, we'll take a look at it now. All right, how many people saw the moonwalking bear? I mean, if you can call it moonwalking, like don't disqualify that because it's not really, okay. So now we have a lot more people that saw that. So the moonwalking bear was there both times. This isn't some sort of like visual trickery, and I'll upload this this PowerPoint so that you have all these resources. But it was glaring. It was right there. It was literally in the middle of the screen. It was moving. It's not something that we see every day. It's not something that we would expect in this context of 2 teams doing basketball drills. And yet just about everybody in this room missed the moonwalking bear on the first time that we were going through this. That's an indication of two things. Number one, that's an indication that a lot of the outside world, you are serial processing it. You're processing it piece by piece by piece by piece by piece. What's interesting is that we don't have the feeling that we process it piece by piece by piece. We kind of have the feeling that we're processing everything at the exact same time. And again, this has this idea of what is it that we're attending to? What is it that we are focusing on? A lot of people have asked, would you have been more likely to notice the moonwalking bear if you were focusing on the team in, actually, it shouldn't be white there, it should be black. So you were asked to count the number of teams, passes that the white team makes. So you were literally in your mind switching on this serial processor for white teammates making passes, and you were not dedicating resources to processing anything else. Question is, would you be more likely to notice that moonwalking bear if instead they said, hey, focus on the black team? Because maybe the team in black, if you were processing things in black, wearing black, that moonwalking bear would have fallen into that category and you would have been like, oh, hey, wait a second. What about that moonwalking bear? So what does this have to say about how our attention works? What does it say about how we attend to things? The biggest takeaway that change detection has shown is that we are aware of much less of the environment than we actually think we are. And we are aware of much less of our external reality than we actually think we are. And when we get to perception, we're going to see that part of the reason for this is because we, very much like that Roomba, oftentimes use the external world as the representation for the external world. So I don't need to represent a lot of the external world in my brain, or sorry, in my mind, because if I need to figure something out, I can just look at the external world. So if I want to know how many embedded lights are there on that wall over there, I can just look. 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4, and I'll survive. And I'll, be successful living in this world and navigating in this world. We don't have to process a lot of the external world at the same time because we use it as its own representation. So think about how often you process the clothes that are on your body. You probably were not even thinking of the clothes that were on your body until I said, hey, how often do you process the clothes that are on your body? And now you're kind of noticing, oh yeah, you know what, it's kind of a little tight over here. Maybe my jeans, riding a little bit up or whatever, think I'm a little uncomfortable, I'm going to shift in my seat. All of that was there. All that information was there, but you weren't attending to it. Now, the reason that you don't attend to it is because a lot of the external world doesn't often change very much. So this is a kind of thought exercise for you to think about. How much more attention would you put on your clothing and processing your clothing if at random intervals during the day your clothing disappeared? So let's say that we lived in a world where you could be walking down the street and all of a sudden your pants disappeared. In the world that we live in right now, if you were walking down the street and all of a sudden your pants disappeared, you probably wouldn't notice it until somebody came up to you and said, hey, where are your pants? And then you'd look down and go, oh my gosh, my pants are gone. Well, we don't live in a world where pants disappear. So we don't need to divert, keep pointing to my brain, we don't need to divert that power of our mind and the processing in our mind to process our pants and determine whether they're still there. So change detection is another one of these things that indicates that our brain, our mind, it's a bad day for brain-mind distinguishing. Our mind is as good as it needs to be while using as little resources as it possibly can. All right, so occasionally when I do this demonstration, I end up with a class where the majority of them had already seen the moonwalking bear. That was a nice situation where this wasn't the case today, but I did have a backup and I like this one as well. So in case you've already seen the moonwalking bear, we're going to take a look at one more. And I would ask you to take a look and answer, does the inspector's coat change? And because we've already experienced this with the moonwalking bear, I'll also say, does anything else weird happen? All right, so does the inspector's coat change and does anything else weird happen?
Somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death in a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I'm buttering his lordship's gold below stairs.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe. Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. It's just a matter of observation. It's how observant were you?
All right, so how observant were you? So I gave you a goal-directed attention challenge. I said, take a look if the inspector's coat changes. Does the inspector's coat change? Yes, it does. Does anybody remember what color it used to be? It was what? It was gray. I'm gonna pretend like I'm an unprepared improver. It's like, hey, does anybody have a color for the coat? I think I heard gray, right? All right. Does anybody have a style? Anime? Sure. All right, so coat used to be gray. Any other changes? Yep. Okay, so do you remember what they were holding and then what it changed to?
I think the butler was holding, well, I assume the butler was holding a rolling pin.
Okay, rolling pin changed to a candlestick.
I forgot what the other player was holding, I'm not sure it was that. And then the guy on the floor also changed.
All right, guy on the floor changed. Yep.
At the beginning, it was a bear.
Bear changed into a suit of armor. Any others? Okay, so we had, yep,
Was the inspector always holding a hat?
what's that?
Was the inspector always holding a hat?
Was the inspector always holding a
I
hat?
don't know if it just
Yeah.
stands out to me now because of the color of the coat. or
Yeah.
If,
Okay, so we have three definites. Two people holding things that may be changed and maybe the inspector's hat was there or changed. Yep,
I think the person that died changed too.
yep, person that died was changed as well. Yep. Flowers in the pot that the lady was, Mrs. Smythe was holding, or flowers, the ones on the left changed? All right, we got flowers in a pot that changed. Okay, so we got a room full of people. We got 5 for sure changes that were noticed, 3 maybe changes that were noticed. And I make that distinction because there was 21 changes. So a room full of people noticed 5 for sure, 3 for maybe. And again, I do the 5 for sure, 3 for maybe, because you could have literally pointed to anything in the room and you probably would have been correct. So here's a backstage look.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's gold below stairs.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
All right, so you can see we are just not that good at really attending to the world that is around us, to our external reality. And again, the reason for that, if I can bring this back a little bit. The reason for that is that we don't live in that world, right? We don't live in a world where dead people change into other dead people. We don't live in a world where pictures turn around. We don't live in a world where bears turn into suits of armor. And that's why we don't process the world in a way that we would have if we needed to notice those changes. So our world is pretty stable and our attentional systems are made to interact with this world, and it's made to interact with a world that is pretty stable. Now, we're gonna set up next class. That's all that we're gonna cover for today, but I'm gonna set up next class. Every single time I do this demonstration, every single time that I do the whodunit, one of the changes that is noticed the most is the bear. The bear that turns into the suit of armor. So that is usually one of the ones that people notice. And does anybody have an idea why the bear changing into the suit of armor is noticed? So it is one of the few changes that is not done seamlessly. So when the bear is taken out and the suit of armor is put in there, if you pay attention, you'll see the suit of armor kind of moving back and forth like this. And motion in our external reality is something that just pulls your attention to it, right? That's why when somebody is trying to, get your attention in a crowd of people, they'll put their hand up and they'll start waving, because motion is something that just grabs our attention. So that is what we're going to take a look at next time. We're going to take a look at, well, we know what attention, we have an idea of what attention is right now and the different types of attention. So the last thing that we're going to do to finish this off is take a look at, where does attention come from? So what is it when you get attention that's grabbed by something in the external world? What is it when you are being given a goal or a problem to solve? Like, notice that the inspector's coat changes. What does that say about how attention works? Yep.
Would that also partially explain why the moonwalking bear wasn't as easy to grab our attention, because it was moving relatively slow compared to fast basketball players who were.
That is actually a really, really good point. So motion can grab our attention, but if our motion processors are already processing other motion, it wouldn't grab our attention as much. So the analog would be, if somebody's trying to get your attention in a crowd and they're waving their hands, like this, and at that exact moment, the concert, the performer goes, wave your hands in the air and wave them like you just don't care, and you're not going to notice that person anymore. Is because, again, your attention needs to process all those pieces of information, and motion grabs it. But if all the motion is there, then there's nothing for your attention. There's nothing there to grab your attention. Yeah, good point. Any final ideas? All right, so that is it for today, it for this week. So stay safe out there, and next time that we meet, we will finish up with attention. Also, this is the first week where there is something due at the end of the week. So I believe there's a COG lab that's due. So COG labs, just so that you know, they're participation only. So just participate in them. It is literally impossible to do a COG lab wrong. Just go in there. It's a demonstration of some of the things that we are looking at, discussing, so that you can get that first person real world experience of it. But other than that, we are done for today.